Millionaire mother hadn't walked for 20 years, until the new Black Maid did the impossible. The morning sun barely touched the windows of the Harrison mansion when Margaret Harrison sat in her wheelchair, staring at the same crack in the ceiling she had memorized for 20 years. The title of her life story could have been Millionaire Mother Hadn't Walked for 20 Years, until the new Black Maid did the impossible, but at that moment, she didn't know her story was about to change forever. Her fingers, once strong enough to play concert piano, now trembled as she reached for the silver bell on her bedside table. The bell that summoned help. The bell that reminded her every single day that she was helpless. 20 years ago, Margaret had been different. She had been the woman who built Harrison Industries from nothing, who raised 3 children while running board meetings, who danced at charity galas until dawn. Then came that terrible morning when she woke up and her legs simply wouldn't move. The doctors called it a rare neurological condition. They used big words that meant nothing and everything at the same time. They meant she would never walk again. They meant her life as she knew it was over. Her children had grown up watching their mother fade from a force of nature into a shadow behind expensive curtains. James, her eldest, now ran the company with cold efficiency but visited less and less. Sarah lived in London, sending flowers every month but never herself. And little Thomas, who wasn't so little anymore at 35, had stopped believing in miracles the day his mother stopped trying to stand. The mansion had seen dozens of caregivers over the years. They came with credentials and references, with gentle smiles and practiced patience. They lasted weeks, sometimes months, before Margaret's bitterness drove them away. She didn't mean to be cruel, but watching others walk so easily while she remained trapped made her heart grow thorns. The latest one had quit just yesterday, unable to handle what she called Mrs. Harrison's impossible temperament. Margaret had laughed bitterly at that. Everything about her life had become impossible. The agency had called that morning, promising to send someone new by noon. Margaret didn't care anymore. They would come, they would try, they would leave. It was the pattern of her life now, as predictable as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. When the doorbell rang at exactly 12 o'clock, Margaret didn't even look up from her book. She heard the butler, old Charles, who had been with the family for 40 years, opening the door. She heard footsteps, lighter than most, crossing the marble floor. Then a voice, warm like honey and strong like steel, said, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Harrison. My name is Ruby Washington, and I'm here to help you remember how to fly." Margaret's head snapped up so fast her neck hurt. Standing in her doorway was a black woman who couldn't have been more than 40, with eyes that sparkled like she knew secrets the world had forgotten. Ruby wasn't tall, but she stood like someone who had never learned how to shrink. Her hair was pulled back in neat braids, and she wore a simple blue dress that somehow looked more elegant than any designer gown Margaret had ever worn. "I don't need help flying," Margaret said coldly, her defense mechanisms rising like walls. "I need help existing. And if you're here to give me false hope like all the others, you can leave right now." Ruby didn't flinch. Instead, she walked into the room uninvited and sat down in the chair beside Margaret's wheelchair. Nobody ever sat at her level. They always stood, looking down at her like she was something broken that needed fixing. "Tell me about the last time you danced," Ruby said, as if they were old friends catching up over tea. Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "What does that have to do with anything? I haven't danced in 20 years. I can't even stand." Ruby leaned forward, and for the first time in decades, someone looked at Margaret like she was still whole. "I didn't ask when you last stood. I asked when you last danced. There's dancing in your eyes, Mrs. Harrison. I can see it trying to escape." Something cracked inside Margaret's chest, something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it existed. "The last time I danced," she whispered, "was the night before everything changed. It was my wedding anniversary. Richard was still alive then. We danced to our song in the garden under the stars. I wore a blue dress, the same shade as the midnight sky. I felt like I could touch the moon if I reached high enough." Ruby smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. That woman is still in there. She's just been sleeping. But I think it's time to wake her up. Margaret wanted to laugh, wanted to cry, wanted to scream that it was impossible. 20 years of the best doctors in the world had told her she would never walk again. But something in Ruby's eyes made her pause. It wasn't pity or false cheerfulness. It was certainty, as solid as the mountains. You don't understand, Margaret said, her voice breaking. The doctors have tried everything. Physical therapy, experimental treatments, surgeries that cost more than most people's houses. Nothing worked. My nervous system is damaged beyond repair. It's not about willpower or positive thinking. It's about science, and science says I will never walk again. Ruby stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains that Margaret kept closed. Sunlight flooded the room, making Margaret squint. Mrs. Harrison, I grew up in Mississippi with my grandmother who was born in 1921. She couldn't read or write because they wouldn't let black children go to school in her town. Science and society said she would never amount to anything. But she raised 12 children, started her own seamstress business, and lived to see her great-granddaughter graduate from medical school. That was me, by the way. Ruby turned back to face Margaret. I was a doctor for 10 years. I worked in hospitals where they told families there was no hope. Sometimes they were right. But sometimes the human body surprises us. Sometimes healing comes from places medicine doesn't understand yet. I left medicine because I realized I could help people more by believing in impossible things than by repeating what textbooks said. Margaret felt tears building behind her eyes. Why would you leave being a doctor to become a maid? Ruby's smile grew wider. Because being a maid lets me into people's homes, into their real lives. It lets me see what they really need, not just what they think they need. And you, Mrs. Harrison, need someone who refuses to see you as broken. The room fell silent except for the ticking clock. Margaret studied Ruby's face, searching for the catch, the lie, the moment when this would all fall apart like everything else had. But Ruby just stood there, patient and solid, like she had all the time in the world. Even if you could help me, Margaret said slowly, why would you? You don't know me. I'm not a nice person anymore. I've become bitter and angry and impossible to be around. Ask anyone. Ruby walked back and knelt beside the wheelchair, taking Margaret's cold hands in her warm ones. Because 23 years ago, a rich white woman found me crying in a hospital bathroom after my daughter was diagnosed with a condition that would leave her paralyzed. That woman didn't know me, had no reason to care, but she paid for every treatment, every therapy, every experimental procedure. She never told me her name, just said to pass on the kindness someday. My daughter is 25 now. She just ran her first marathon last month. Margaret's tears finally fell, 20 years of them, flooding down her cheeks like a dam had broken. Ruby held her hands tighter. I've been looking for my chance to pass on that kindness. I think I just found it. That first afternoon, Ruby didn't try any exercises or treatments. She simply talked to Margaret, really talked to her, about things that had nothing to do with her condition. They talked about books and music, about the garden visible through the window that Margaret hadn't seen in years, about Ruby's grandmother's cornbread recipe and Margaret's mother's apple pie. For the first time in 20 years, Margaret felt like a person instead of a patient. When evening came and Ruby prepared to leave, Margaret felt panic rise in her chest. Will you come back tomorrow? She asked, hating how vulnerable she sounded. Ruby squeezed her shoulder gently. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. That night, Margaret slept without the sleeping pills she usually needed. She dreamed about dancing, and for once, the dream didn't feel like torture. Ruby came back the next day, and the next, and the next. But she didn't do what the other caregivers had done. She didn't immediately start with exercises or stretches or any of the traditional physical therapy routines. Instead, she started with Margaret's spirit. She opened all the curtains in the house, letting light flood rooms that had been dark for decades. She brought in fresh flowers every morning, filling the air with the scent of roses and lavender. She played music, the old jazz records that Margaret and Richard used to dance to, letting the melodies float through the mansion like ghosts of happier times. At first, Margaret resisted. "This is pointless," she would say when Ruby encouraged her to sing along to the music. "Singing won't make my legs work." But Ruby was persistent without being pushy, patient without being patronizing. "We're not trying to fix your legs yet," she would say. "We're trying to remember who you were before you forgot." Slowly, Margaret began to thaw. She found herself humming along to the music, then singing. She started asking Ruby to wheel her to different rooms, wanting to see parts of her house she'd ignored for years. The library where she used to read to her children. The kitchen where she once cooked Sunday dinners for the whole family. The ballroom where she'd hosted parties that people still talked about. One morning, about 2 weeks after Ruby arrived, she found Margaret crying in the sunroom. The old woman was holding a photo album, her fingers tracing pictures of herself from before. There she was, climbing a mountain in Switzerland. There she was, teaching James to ride a bike. There she was, dancing at Sarah's wedding, spinning in a circle of yellow silk. "I was so strong," Margaret whispered. "I was unstoppable. And now look at me. I'm nothing." Ruby sat beside her and gently took the album. She flipped to a blank page at the back. "This isn't the end of your story, Mrs. Harrison. This is just an intermission. The best chapters are still to come." Margaret laughed bitterly. "How can you say that? I'm 70 years old and I can't even stand up to brush my own teeth." Ruby stood and walked to the window, where morning light was painting the garden gold. "Can I tell you something? My grandmother, the one I told you about, she didn't learn to read until she was 68. She said the words had been waiting for her all that time, patient as seeds in winter soil. Your legs have been sleeping, Mrs. Harrison, but that doesn't mean they're dead." That afternoon, Ruby did something unexpected. Instead of working on Margaret's legs, she started with her hands. She brought out a small piano keyboard, the kind children learn on, and placed it on Margaret's lap. "Play," she said simply. Margaret's fingers had been shaking for years, another casualty of her condition. But as she touched the keys, muscle memory older than her injury took over. The melody was shaky at first, notes stumbling over each other like drunken dancers. But Ruby didn't criticize or correct. She just sat and listened, her eyes closed, swaying slightly to the imperfect music. Day by day, Margaret's hands grew steadier. The music grew stronger. And something else began to happen that Margaret didn't notice at first. As her fingers danced across the keys, her toes began to move too, just slightly, keeping time with the rhythm. Ruby noticed, but she said nothing. She just smiled and kept encouraging Margaret to play. 3 weeks into Ruby's employment, she brought something new. A large basin filled with warm water infused with herbs that smelled like mint and something earthy Margaret couldn't identify. "My grandmother's recipe," Ruby explained, gently removing Margaret's slippers. She said it could wake up sleeping feet. Margaret wanted to protest that this was superstition, not medicine. But the water felt so good, and Ruby's hands were so gentle as she massaged Margaret's feet and calves, working on muscles that hadn't been properly touched in years. Most caregivers had been perfunctory, doing the minimum required exercises. Ruby worked like she was handling something precious, something that deserved reverence. "There's still strength here," Ruby murmured, her fingers finding muscles that had atrophied but not disappeared. "Your body remembers, Mrs. Harrison. We just need to remind it." That night, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years. Her legs ached. Not the numb, disconnected discomfort she sometimes felt, but a real, deep ache like she'd been exercising. She didn't tell Ruby, afraid to hope, afraid to be disappointed. But she held on to that pain like a secret treasure, proof that something in her body was still alive. The next morning, Ruby arrived to find Margaret already awake and sitting up straighter than usual. "I want to try," Margaret said before Ruby could even say good morning. "I don't know what exactly, but I want to try something more." Ruby's smile could have powered the entire city. "I was hoping you'd say that." She brought in a standing frame, something Margaret had rejected years ago when physical therapists had tried to use it. But this time felt different. Ruby didn't approach it like medical equipment. She decorated it with ribbons and flowers, making it look less like a torture device and more like a garden trellis. "We're going to take this slow," Ruby said, positioning the frame beside Margaret's chair. "Today, we're just going to see if you can put weight on your legs for 10 seconds. Not stand, not walk, just feel the ground beneath you again." Margaret's heart pounded as Ruby helped her position herself. Her legs felt like strangers, disconnected things that didn't belong to her. But as Ruby supported her weight and helped her lean forward, Margaret felt something she'd forgotten existed. Pressure. Solid ground pushing back against her feet. It lasted only 5 seconds before her knees buckled and Ruby had to catch her, but Margaret was sobbing with joy. "I felt it," she gasped. "I felt the floor. Ruby, I felt it." Ruby was crying too, both women holding each other in a moment of pure triumph. It wasn't walking. It wasn't even really standing. But it was a beginning. Over the next weeks, those 5 seconds became 10, then 20, then a full minute. Margaret's legs shook like newborn colts, and she had to grip the frame so hard her knuckles turned white, but she was vertical. She was looking at the world from the height she was meant to see it. Ruby never pushed too hard, never demanded more than Margaret could give. But she also never let Margaret give up. On the days when the pain was too much, when Margaret wanted to quit, Ruby would tell her stories. Stories about her grandmother learning to read by candlelight. Stories about her daughter taking her first steps after doctors said she never would. Stories about ordinary people doing impossible things because they simply refused to accept that impossible was the final answer. 6 weeks after Ruby arrived, Margaret stood for 5 full minutes without the frame, just holding Ruby's hands. Her children still didn't know. Margaret had forbidden Ruby from telling them, too afraid of their reactions, too afraid of failing in front of them. But that day, as she stood there swaying slightly but standing, Margaret said, "Call James. Tell him to bring Sarah and Thomas. Tell them it's urgent." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Margaret nodded, her jaw set with determination. "If I'm going to fall, I want them to see me trying. And if I'm going to fly, I want them to see that too." The call was made. James arrived within an hour, his face tight with worry. Sarah flew in from London that evening. Thomas drove through the night from Boston. They all converged on the mansion the next morning, expecting bad news, expecting to be told their mother was dying. Instead, they found her in the ballroom. The ballroom that had been closed for 20 years. Margaret was in her wheelchair, but she was wearing a dress instead of her usual robe. Her hair was styled. She was wearing lipstick. And beside her stood Ruby, dressed in a simple black dress, looking like she was about to conduct a symphony. "Mother, what's going on?" James demanded, his CEO voice sharp with concern. "Are you ill?" The message said it was urgent. Margaret looked at her children, these adults who had once been babies in her arms, who had watched her fade away year by year. "I need you to watch something," she said simply. "And whatever happens, I need you to remember that trying is not the same as failing." Before any of them could respond, Ruby turned on the music. It was the song Margaret and Richard had danced to on their wedding day, a slow jazz number that filled the ballroom like golden honey. Ruby helped Margaret position her hands on the arms of the wheelchair, then stepped back. The room held its breath as Margaret began to push. Her arms trembled. Her face contorted with effort. But inch by inch, she raised herself from the chair. Sarah gasped. Thomas grabbed James's arm. James stood frozen, his mouth open in shock. Margaret's legs shook violently, but they held her weight. She stood there, tears streaming down her face, looking at her children from the height they remembered from childhood. 20 years, she said, her voice breaking. 20 years I've been sitting, and I forgot what it felt like to stand tall. But Ruby, she reminded me that impossible is just a word people use when they've stopped trying. She took a step. Just one step, but it might as well have been a mile. Her children rushed forward, but Ruby held up a hand, stopping them. Let her finish, she said quietly. Margaret took another step, then another. She made it 5 steps before her strength gave out and Ruby had to catch her, both of them laughing and crying as they slowly made their way back to the chair. The room erupted. Sarah was sobbing, hugging her mother so tight Margaret could barely breathe. Thomas was on his knees beside the wheelchair, holding Margaret's hands and repeating, "How," over and over. James stood back, tears rolling down his stoic face, looking between his mother and Ruby with an expression of awe and disbelief. The doctors said it was impossible, he finally managed. We spent millions. We tried everything. Ruby stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Sometimes healing doesn't come from money or medicine. Sometimes it comes from believing in someone so hard that they start believing in themselves again. Your mother never lost the ability to walk. She lost the belief that she could. We just had to find it again, buried under 20 years of being told no. Margaret reached for Ruby's hand, squeezing it tight. She saw me, she told her children. Not the wheelchair, not the condition, not the bitter old woman I'd become. She saw me, the real me, and she refused to let that person disappear. Over the following months, Margaret's progress continued. Some days were harder than others. Some days she could walk across the entire room. Some days she could barely stand. But every day, she tried. And every day, Ruby was there, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. The mansion transformed. The curtains stayed open. Music played constantly. The children visited more often, bringing their own children to see their grandmother not as a figure of pity but as a figure of inspiration. Margaret started playing piano again, her fingers growing stronger and more confident. She began hosting small dinners, nothing like the grand parties of before, but gatherings filled with laughter and life. The garden that had been neglected for 2 decades bloomed again under Margaret and Ruby's care, the two women working side by side, Margaret sometimes in her chair, sometimes standing, always smiling. But the real miracle wasn't in Margaret's legs. It was in her spirit. The bitterness that had poisoned her for 20 years melted away like ice in spring. She laughed again, really laughed, the kind that made her whole body shake. She started painting, something she'd loved as a young woman but had abandoned. She called old friends she'd pushed away, rebuilding bridges she'd burned. She became the mother her children remembered, the woman her husband had fallen in love with. 1 year after Ruby arrived, Margaret stood at her granddaughter's wedding. Not for the whole ceremony, she still needed the wheelchair for longer events, but she stood as the bride walked down the aisle. She stood for the father-daughter dance. And when the music changed to that old jazz number, the one she and Richard had loved, she took Ruby's hand and they swayed together for one perfect song. The whole room watched in amazement as Margaret Harrison, the woman who hadn't walked for 20 years, danced. It wasn't the dancing of her youth, all grace and flowing movement. It was something better. It was dancing that knew the weight of sorrow and chose joy anyway. It was dancing that had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. It was dancing that said, I am still here, I am still alive, I am still me. After the song ended and Margaret sank gratefully back into her chair, exhausted but radiant, James approached Ruby. I need to know something, he said quietly. Are you really a doctor? Did you use some treatment the others didn't know about? Ruby smiled, that same warm smile she'd worn the day she arrived. I was a doctor, yes. But what I did for your mother wasn't medicine. It was simpler and more complicated than that. I just refused to see her as broken. In my experience, sometimes that's all the medicine someone needs. Margaret overheard and called out, "Ruby didn't fix my legs, James. She fixed my hope." And hope, it turns out, is stronger than any muscle. As the wedding celebration continued around them, Margaret reached for Ruby's hand. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking about that woman who helped you all those years ago. The one who paid for your daughter's treatment." Ruby nodded, listening. Margaret's eyes twinkled with mischief. "I think I might know who she was." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Margaret pulled out an old checkbook from her purse, one she hadn't used in over 20 years. She flipped through it until she found what she was looking for. A carbon copy of a check made out to Hospital General Charity Fund, with a note in the memo line, "For the young mother in the bathroom. Tell her to pass it on." Ruby's eyes widened as she recognized the date, the amount, the hospital. "It was you?" she whispered. Margaret smiled, tears glittering in her eyes. "I was having tests done that day. The tests that would tell me I'd never walk again. I was so scared, so angry at the world. Then I heard you crying, and I realized that my money could mean nothing to me or everything to someone else. I chose to make it mean everything." Ruby was crying now, full-body sobs that shook her strong shoulders. "All this time, I was looking for a stranger to repay, and it was you. You brought me to yourself." Margaret pulled Ruby into a fierce embrace. "No, my dear. You brought yourself. You brought your gift, your strength, your refusal to accept defeat. You didn't repay a debt. You completed a circle. You gave me back what I had lost, not just my mobility, but my faith in miracles." The two women held each other as the wedding swirled around them, grandmother and granddaughter dancing, music filling the air with joy. Margaret thought about the title of her story, The Impossible Thing That Had Become Possible. 20 years of darkness had ended not with medical breakthrough or scientific discovery, but with one person seeing another person's light when they couldn't see it themselves. "Ruby," Margaret said softly, "would you consider staying? Not as a maid, not as a caregiver, but as family. This house has been a tomb for so long. You've made it a home again." Ruby pulled back to look at Margaret's face, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear of rejection. "Mrs. Harrison, I told you that first day that wild horses couldn't keep me away. That's still true. But I'm not staying because you need me. I'm staying because this is where I belong. This is my family now too." As if to punctuate her words, little Emma, Margaret's youngest granddaughter, ran over and threw her arms around both women. "Grandma Maggie. Miss Ruby. Come dance with me." And they did. Margaret in her wheelchair, Ruby standing beside her, and Emma twirling between them, 3 generations brought together by the impossible made real. The music played on, and Margaret thought about her life story. How it had seemed to end in that wheelchair 20 years ago. How she had believed the doctors who said she would never walk again. How she had given up on herself, on joy, on the possibility of change. But then Ruby had walked through her door with her certainty and her warmth and her absolute refusal to accept that Margaret's story was over. She had done the impossible, not through medicine or miracle, but through the simple, revolutionary act of believing. Now, as Margaret watched her family dance and laugh and live in the house that had been silent for so long, she knew that the title of her story was perfect. Millionaire Mother hadn't walked for 20 years, until the new Black Maid did the impossible. But it wasn't really about walking. It had never been about walking. It was about resurrection. It was about the way one person's faith can reignite another person's fire. It was about the impossible becoming possible when someone refuses to accept that impossible is the end of the story. Margaret would never run marathons. She would never climb mountains again. Some days, she still needed the wheelchair for everything. But she had learned to stand. She had learned to take steps. She had learned to dance. Most importantly, she had learned to hope again. And in the end, that was the most impossible thing of all. As the night wound down and guests began to leave, Margaret sat in her chair, tired but happy. Ruby sat beside her, both women comfortable in the silence that comes from deep understanding. "Thank you," Margaret said simply. Ruby shook her head. "No, thank you. You gave my daughter her life. You gave me purpose. You gave me a home." Margaret smiled, looking around the ballroom that had been closed for 20 years, now alive with the echoes of celebration. "We gave each other the impossible," she said. "And that, my dear Ruby, is the greatest gift of all." The grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Margaret reached for Ruby's hand, and together they watched the moon rise through the ballroom windows, painting everything in silver light. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Tomorrow Margaret might struggle to stand. Tomorrow the doctors might shake their heads and mutter about temporary improvements and false hope. But tonight she had danced. Tonight she had stood tall. Tonight she had proven that sometimes, the impossible just needs someone stubborn enough to insist it's possible. And as Ruby wheeled her to her room, humming softly the jazz tune they both now loved, Margaret knew that her story, the real story, was just beginning. Because miracles, she had learned, don't always come from heaven. Sometimes they come from Mississippi, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a grandmother's wisdom. Sometimes they come from refusing to accept that broken means worthless. Sometimes they come from one person looking at another and saying, "I see you, the real you, and you are not finished yet." The mansion settled into sleep, but in Margaret's room, a small light remained on. She was writing in a journal, something she hadn't done in 20 years. The first entry was simple: "Today I stood. Today I danced. Today I lived. Tomorrow I will try again. And Ruby will be there, steady as stone, soft as sunrise, reminding me that impossible is just a word." The title of my story used to be about what I couldn't do. Now it's about what becomes possible when someone believes in you harder than you believe in your own limitations. This is my impossible story. And it's only just begun. As she closed the journal and turned off the light, Margaret heard Ruby's voice from the guest room down the hall, talking on the phone to her daughter. "Yes, baby, miracles do happen. I'm living in one right now. A woman who couldn't walk for 20 years danced tonight. And you know what the real miracle is? She taught me that I could fly too." Margaret smiled in the darkness, her legs aching in the best possible way, her heart full of tomorrow's possibilities. The title of her story was true. She had been a millionaire mother who hadn't walked for 20 years, until a black maid did the impossible. But the real truth was simpler and more profound. Two women had saved each other. Two women had refused to accept that broken was the end. Two women had found family in the most unexpected place. And that, Margaret thought as sleep finally took her, was the most impossible and beautiful thing of all.